So we're going to be welcoming Phil Gilbert to the stage. But before we bring him up here, I just want to put a couple things out there. So I think Doug asked us to kind of hold on to a sentence earlier as he was bringing us through the plan for the day and talking about the speakers that were going to join us on stage. And it was 400,000 people across 180 countries, and not one of them reported to Phil. And as he led global design for IBM. I think that's something to hold on to, because that is the epitome of matrixed organization, I think, as you're trying to impact and influence change across the organization. And you can learn more about that in his Irresistible Change book. I see a few copies across tables here, but if you haven't grabbed a copy of that, there's some out in the atrium that you can snag before you leave today. Great read. And with that, I really want to welcome Phil to the stage, and he's going to share that story, both some of the lessons from his book and his time at IBM. So with that, I'll welcome him up.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right. That was fantastic to see the proof of what can happen with real commitment to AI and a real commitment to the culture that it takes to make that happen at scale. I sold my company to IBM in 2010. We had about 250 people, and I was entering a company of 400,000. What happened next, or over the next couple of years, became a decade-long lesson, some would say obsession, into how transformation at scale really works. And today I want to try to connect that experience directly into what you're going through today. The questions that each of you are being asked by your management, by your board, where are we on the AI journey? Oops. Sorry about that. Where are we on the AI journey is exactly the wrong question. The question you should be asking is, what are we trying to become? What do we need to do with AI to become genuinely different from our competitors? That's a transformation question. And I know a little bit about that. And in the next few minutes, I want to try to give you a framework for how to think about that. As I said, in 2010, I went into IBM, and the IBM that I entered was one that was built for the status quo. It was very comfortable with products that, quite frankly, our customers didn't like, but they used them because they had to. I walked into a set of buildings and into a physical plant that was not built for the modern collaboration that the 21st century needs. In fact, it looked like something out of the 1970s. Probably hadn't been updated since the 1970s. All of it was designed to protect the status quo. Consistency was more important than innovation. And while I had made kind of a spiritual commitment to myself and my team that I would hang around for about a year for the integration of our company into IBM, after about 2 months, I flew to Armonk, which is IBM's headquarters, and I had dinner with the senior vice president, and IBM speak. There's the CEO, there's the senior vice president, and then the general managers run each of the lines of business. This was the senior vice president over the line of business that my company had been acquired into. His name was Robert LeBlanc, and he and I were having dinner, and I said, Robert, I'm looking around and I'm seeing people that I don't understand. I'm seeing processes that make no sense, and I'm seeing a company that, generally speaking, is very comfortable not delivering excellence. I don't see myself here. And what he said next reframed my entire career. He said, you're looking around at what you see that exists, systems that exist, processes that exist, people that exist. He goes, we need to change. You have an idea of where we might go. What can you do to help? What can you do to help? And I said, well, you can make me the CEO. And he said, that's not going to happen. But why don't I put you in charge of the small subdivision that you were bought into, a group of about 1,200 people that was in the market space that we were in. And he said, take that over, run that group. And we did that. And over the next 18 months, we took a portfolio that was a very confused portfolio of about 44 products down to 4. We took 1,200 people down to 700, and we took massive market share against our competitors. We grew at about 35% in a space that was growing at about 5%. And on the back of that story, by the end of 2011, we got a new CEO, and her name was Jenny Rometty. And she heard that story. Market share up, costs down, customers happy, employees, we were the most engaged employee segment of all of the employees at IBM. And so Jenny asked me basically the same thing as Robert, which is, sorry that this keeps changing. Whatever you did there, can we do it everywhere? 400,000 people, roughly 3,000 products, 5,000 teams we estimated doing anything at any given point in time, and 180 countries, none of whom reported to me. And so, as I started to think about that problem, I started to, first of all, it blew my mind. How do you get 400,000 people, not a single one of them report to you, do what you want them to do? How do you get them to transform? How do you get them to change when everybody knows that people resist change, or so the story goes? And so one of the things that I did is I went to a lot of other companies, and I looked around companies that were doing great in the market and companies that were not doing great in the market. In my particular case, I was bringing in a particular form of design called design thinking, coupled with agile, coupled with the formal skills that designers bring to a problem. And I went to companies that you would instantly recognize as being great at design. Companies like Braun, Apple, the Coca-Cola Company, Hermes, John Deere. And I went to a lot of companies that you would not associate with great design, companies that were not doing as well in the marketplace. And here's what I found. I found that you could take the design teams from the fantastic companies and the design teams at the laggards, and you could swap them, and you'd never know. What was different about the companies that were great was everybody else. Everybody else in the organization valued that thing. What I may have thought was about design wasn't. It was about culture. Once I realized I had a culture issue, I realized a couple of things. First of all, this was the same kind of problem that any startup has. I had a thing that I was trying to get people to do, to use. I had a solution, which was this new way of working, and yet nobody in the organization necessarily knew it was great for them, and they didn't even probably know that I existed. That's the exact same problem that a startup has with a new product. And that's when I realized change is a product. And I started to think about introducing change to the organization in exactly that way. When you start thinking about something as a product, you start thinking about it very differently. The first thing you start thinking of is you start thinking about brand. You know, one of the problems with these AI first issues, and we're going to get into AI in just a minute, but one of the biggest problems with AI initiatives is we call them AI initiatives. And that does two things. On the part of our users, it immediately has them bring all of their baggage with respect to AI or design or agile or return to office or whatever your change provocation is. They bring their baggage to it. But the second and the more important point is it limits the leadership team's perspective of how they deal with the problem. Once you start thinking about change as a product and you start thinking about branding change, all of a sudden it frees you up to think bigger. It no longer is about AI or design. It's about the values that underpin the brand of change that you're trying to introduce. I started thinking about the market, the people around the organization, and it turns out it's not the people around the organization, as we'll talk about in a minute, it's the teams of the organization, because it's not people that generate outputs in a large enterprise, it's teams. Nothing gets done by individuals. Individuals influence outcomes, but they don't generate outcomes. Teams generate outcomes. And so the market of teams inside of this organization of 400,000 became my market. And one of the things that happened along the way is I started looking at the acceptance of this organization and the change that was being introduced into it. And I started seeing that we ended up with a typical bell curve of execution, a bell curve of goodness, which we will see at any large set of numbers. And once we had a certain number of teams in the program, I started looking at this bell curve of execution, and we had maybe 100 or 150 teams that were starting to adopt these new practices, and they were generating outcomes that were all over the curve. The bottom 10%, you can always, you know why. There's a people issue, there's a technology issue, there's a market issue, there's something like that. The top 10%, your natural athletes, you're always going to know that they're going to succeed. It was the middle 80 that really interested me. And so we went on about a 1.5 year long research project on why do the middle 80% of the teams working all with in these new ways, why do the middle 80% of the teams generate that distribution? What separates the top 40% from the bottom 40%? And what we found were two things. The first thing we found is that every team that was executing in the top half of that middle 80 had some kind of person on the team. They did things behind the scenes. They held their teammates accountable for the outcomes of the team. We didn't quite know at the time what they were, and we called them magic people. It turns out that at about the same time, a great book was introduced into the world, about 2016, I think. It's by a guy named Sam Walker. He was a former Wall Street Journal sports reporter. And Sam asked himself the question, what made the 10 greatest teams of all time the 10 greatest teams of all time? If you're a sports fan, probably everybody in this room is, the first 75 pages are awesome because he first has to determine what are the best 75 teams of all, or best 10 teams of all time. But then it goes into an analysis, and the TLDR of it all is, it was never the superstar, and it was never the manager. It was the captain on the team. The book is called The Captain Class. It was the player that the other players voted to be captain. It was the player that held their teammates accountable on the pitch, on the court, on the gridiron, in the locker room. These were our magic people. Sports teams called them the glue guys. Every team needs to have a glue person. If you find them and you harvest them, make sure that your teams include them. The second finding from that set of research was also pretty interesting, that every one of the better performing teams had somebody in upper management that was taking care of them. My researchers were a bit irreverent, and the initial name for these people were the shit umbrellas. Anybody who's worked in an organization of more than 3 knows exactly what I'm talking about. We changed the name to advocates, but once we started to understand that my initial bias was that middle management, this frozen middle, this notion that middle management resisted change, it turns out it is 100% wrong. middle management doesn't resist change. It's that they have the hardest job in the organization because they have to translate the status of the tactical execution into the strategic reporting that goes upstream to their management. And when you're inserting a change program, you are by definition changing the way the new teams work, and you're breaking that translation. You're breaking the interface that they use to translate what is happening. Most change programs get this wrong, and they educate middle management in the same way that they educate teams. You put them through a class about AI, or you say, go use AI. That's useless to the middle management function. What is necessary is an understanding of how to translate the artifacts and the status of the teams under them using AI into the reporting mechanisms that they have upstream. Once we learned that, we created a class for our new advocates, and we started identifying the glue people and making sure that every team had at least one glue person, and it only takes one. If you have two, you are a stellar team. Once we did those two things, there was a hockey stick approach in the adoption across the enterprise. Today, AI is probably the most significant forcing function of organizational change that I've seen in decades. We've talked about it. I'm not going to, it's obvious. But what's different this time is that in every previous revolution, we've changed the pipes, the rails. We've changed the speed at which things can happen. This one's a little bit different because we're actually changing the content that flows over the pipes. And that's a very different type of transformation. And it's causing us a lot of struggle. In fact, as we all know, a lot of the AI programs are failing. Just in the last couple of months, the IBM Institute for Business Value has said that 25% of any AI project achieves ROI, and only 16% of those scale. Projects have been abandoned. The AI project abandonment rate has gone from 17% in 2024 to about 42% in 2025. That's from the S&P Global Market Study. You know, even at companies that should be fantastic at this, on May 26th, the Uber Chief Operating Officer, Andrew McDonald, had an interview with The Information, which is a technology newsletter out in San Francisco. And he said this: if we're not actually able to draw a direct line to how many useful features and functions we're shipping to our users, our costs become harder to justify. In that same interview, the CTO said that the company blew through its entire AI budget in April. Its entire AI budget for the year, it blew through in April. And the COO is saying they can't draw a line between the AI outputs and the customer outcomes that they're trying to achieve. That's Uber, one of the most sophisticated companies on the planet. You may think this is about AI. This is about culture. So I want to discuss a few changes that I think need to be made in AI programs. First of all, we need to shift the paradigm. Today, there's an anti-pattern of measuring outputs over outcomes. How many CEOs are asking things like, what percentage of our code is being written with AI? That's useless. It's meaningless. Again, it's because every AI rollout starts with the technology. Here's the tool, here's the license, here's the rollout plan, here's the education. Go generate some emails. Go build some contracts. That's exactly backwards. Tools without culture don't change anything. Not really. They just give people new ways to do old things. The organizations that are failing aren't doing that because the models aren't good enough. They're failing because their cultures aren't changing. I want to give you 3 things to think about as you think about your AI rollout. Sorry about this. First of all, teams. I talked about teams. It's all about the project team, not the individual. In fact, the project team is the atomic unit of any transformation effort. One of the things that we did at IBM is we did not do any generic training. Whenever anybody was onboarded into our change program, it was the team that was accepted into the program. I talked earlier about branding. Our branding was actually the hallmark program. It had nothing to do with design, had nothing to do with agile, had nothing to do with design thinking. It was the hallmark brand, and it had 3 values underneath it. The user was central to everything. We were going to restlessly reinvent or constantly prototype, and we were going to do it with diverse, empowered teams. These teams became the central force of everything. When we onboarded a team, we didn't give generic training. We had the team bring their project to the first boot camp. Every single interaction with every single team in the transformation program was on the terms of their project. In fact, the promise was at their first week boot camp, if you don't leave Friday with about a 10x difference from where you would have been, go back to the old ways. You'll never hear from us again. That never happened, but that was the promise. That was the onus that my team took on as a part of the program. If your teams aren't experiencing that kind of team-based outcome in a week, you shouldn't be doing this. Training or deployment of tools outside the context of a real project is pretty useless, in my opinion. The other thing that we did with respect to teams is we chose mainstream teams. I hear of a lot of transformation programs that fail because they use tiger teams, or they bring the best people to bear, or they cherry pick teams. The teams that you should start with, the teams that you should do this with, are mainstream teams that are funded by the organization, funded by the business, and who would do their jobs even if they didn't have AI. Those are the kinds of results that will prove to the rest of the organization that these changes can take root. The second thing then is about alignment. I think this is particularly true in the era of AI. We developed a very small but a very unique new language around the new ways of working that I think are very appropriate, were appropriate to us then and are very appropriate to us now. It was a new language that was centered around understanding and communicating the user's intent and not about the solution itself. In fact, when we originally released our version of our new way of work, which we called the IBM design thinking approach, IBM design thinking, I invented a document that we called a release blueprint. And the release blueprint contained the entirety of the spec, the users we were addressing, the product space we were addressing, the market we were addressing, and all of the team aligned around the release blueprint, which was everything that we intended to deliver to the market except for the implementation. Now, at the time, implementation itself was relatively expensive. What I didn't realize at the time is we were building actually the way to align around the perfect prompt or set of prompts in the AI era. At the time we did this, because execution was so expensive, making sure that product management, design, engineering, marketing, and sales, legal, and finance were all fully aligned around what was exactly expected to be delivered made sense because the cost of delivery was so high. Today, the cost of delivery execution is so low that document is even more valuable than it was. Because today what I see in teams is that teams are now struggling with multiple unaligned prompts across team members and then having to reconcile the results back because they didn't align on intent right up front. This notion about bringing teams in and making the teams the basis of your transformation and making sure that those teams are aligned around the market intent that you intend to deliver is more powerful than ever. And finally, we've talked about the glue people and why they're so important. The second anti-pattern that I see out there with AI is we get fixated with outputs versus outcomes. I talked about this earlier, that too many people are focused on things like percentage of code written by AI or the number of marketing emails generated. These are all vanity metrics that tell you nothing about whether the business is performing differently. Tim Brown, who's the former CEO of IDEO and is now the chairman emeritus, many of you probably know IDEO, the design firm, recently wrote an essay where he calls the efficiency gains from AI the AI dividend. And his warning is, if every competitor captures the same efficiencies, and they will, efficiency alone produces no lasting advantage. Most companies today are capturing this dividend, firing the people, and calling it done. Too many executives, I think, are treating more output faster as the goal. And in doing so, are building cultures of mediocrity. Here's why. Large language models are at their core prediction engines, optimized for the mean. They're sucking in all the information, they're optimizing for the mean. Now you can tune that, you can tune a model toward the top quartile, and the best ones have. But once everybody is using the same models, and they will, everybody's going to be generating top quartile output. The top quartile becomes the new mean. You aren't differentiating, you've just raised the floor. In every domain where you cede judgment to AI, you will end up commoditized. Not because the AI is bad, but because everybody's going to use it. And so you need to start thinking about, how do we pivot from the notion of output to outcome? And this really isn't a pivot at all. It's what we've been doing all along, defining outcomes in terms that your CFO or CHRO or whomever the outcome is being generated for would understand. Not outputs, but outcomes. And building that framework now before the day of reckoning comes. By the way, the pricing that you're currently building your ROI on with your models is not permanent. It's the introductory price, and it's already starting to bankrupt. But think about what happened to cloud costs when Amazon decided it was time to make money. That same reckoning is coming for tokens. I think it's going to be here in about 24 months. And while revenues per millions of tokens, the AI equivalent of revenue per head count, will matter, it's going to be cycle time on decisions, not tasks, that matters more. And directly comparing AI native teams to traditional teams on the same business problems is going to be important. That A/B understanding as you go through this transition and really testing yourself on whether the AI native teams are in fact generating better outcomes for your customers versus the alternative. And being honest about it is, I think, going to separate the best companies from those that lose margin. I think also, as we think about testing is probably one of the most interesting skills that's in transformation today. When at IBM, when we started to rethink what test meant, what test actually meant was to start evaluating the outcomes, the outputs of the team's processes against that release blueprint. And if you think about AI and the large language models today, if you think about the large language model being essentially a new type of compiler, you start to understand how we can start judging the outputs of teams against that release blueprint and treating everything in the middle as a black box, just as developers treat the compiler as a black box. Nobody reads machine code anymore. You just look at the artifact that the machine code renders. That same type of transition is now moving up the stack, and that is how we should start thinking about our marketing processes, our sales processes, everything. Testing becomes judging the output against the intent versus worrying about the process of how the output was generated. I've talked also, ultimately, your gross profit margin is a function of how different your output is from your competitors. If your AI strategy is to do what everyone else does, just faster, your margins will converge. Margins are never made on the happy path. If you think about where most companies are applying AI today, it is actually automating along the happy path of our processes, which, to be honest, are pretty efficient today. But if you think about where differentiation exists, where trust is developed, it's not on the happy path of our processes. It's on the exceptions, whether how you respond to a bad situation or how you over-deliver in a good context. And I think that companies that continue to just drive efficiencies along the happy path of their products and services, again, are just developing and nurturing cultures of mediocrity. Where you should start thinking about strategically using AI and bringing teams into your program is where on the exception paths can we use this new thing to differentiate us even further with our customers and the consumers. The companies that expand margins in this era will be using AI to amplify what is genuinely distinctive about themselves. And finally, I would say that the thing we still need to understand is that human needs don't change. We have a new technology to address them maybe more completely, maybe more deeply, but the human-centered outcomes are still the outcomes that will determine our profit margins and our market share going forward. And as we drive this AI-first agenda, I am seeing company after company starting to deviate even from their human-centered ideals. One thing I'll say about that, I don't know if you remember, but about 2 months ago, Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, came out and he said, AI is going to be all the systems of record. They're all the SaaS, Workday, SAP, they're all gone. AI is going to take over everything. And that next day in the market of the Mag 7, they all dropped about 25%. You remember that day? Workday, Salesforce, they all dropped 25%. IBM. Who didn't drop that day? Apple. Arguably the least AI forward of any of those companies. Not a drop. I think that's telling about how we think about human-centeredness, relationships, and trust. When I was starting this program at IBM, I had come to IBM from a company of 250. And I was looking at driving massive transformation to how 400,000 people did their jobs every day. Quite frankly, turning how we even saw problems on their ear. And one of the only executive vice president was a guy named Steve Mills. And Steve's an iconic guy in the technology industry. Arguably, he and Bill Gates were the two people that actually drove modern software. And Steve was somewhat dubious of my ability to step into this role, which was totally understandable. And he looked at me in a meeting when Jenny was signing off on this, and he said, "How are you going to," he said, "What's your formula?" I was like, "What?" I just went over my whole deck. It's designed. It's like, no. He said, "What's your formula?" And I didn't know what he meant. And that was kind of it. And I was flying back home from Armonk to Austin, Texas that night. And I was, and Steve is somebody who, he was skeptical of what I was trying to do, but he was a guy. I mean, he was a smart guy. And I kept noodling over this notion of, what's my formula? And I had said, culture drives outcomes. Culture is the only thing. You can give, we look back on cultures that had almost nothing, and they did amazing things. How do you build a pyramid, right? I started thinking about this notion of culture equals outcomes, and when I got back to my office the next day, I started noodling about, but culture is so, even though I'm talking about it here, and I've given you some examples, but culture is kind of this, how do you define it? How do you change culture? How do you measure if you're changing culture? 400,000 people, you're not going to change them overnight. I went to the whiteboard and I started noodling around. How would an archaeologist, how do we think about cultures of the past? We dig them up and we measure them. We know how tall they were. We see their habitats. We see where they hunted or gathered. We saw the dwellings that they lived in when they were out doing that. We kind of get a sense for their food. I started thinking about all these different ways that we evaluate a culture. And ultimately, they started circling around these three things. And on my whiteboard, I had culture equals outcomes. And then I put people, their practices, and their places equals culture. Therefore, it's the people, the practices, and the places that define our outcomes. This became my formula. This was how we measured every day at IBM. And all of our goals, all of our executives' goals, every 6 months had to ratchet up to affecting each of these three things. And we would measure that relentlessly as our in-process metrics. How many people are in the program? What types of people do we have? Those magic people, which we ended up calling coaches. How many the glue people? How many glue people were on each team? And we could measure that. How many advocates did we have? And how many teams did not have advocates above them? And how many teams were in the program? How many people were on the teams? How many people had taken the introductory boot camp? And how many people had delivered using the new thing? All of these things were badged and measured. And the practices, which includes tools, which of the new tools were in use by which team? And we measured adoption of those tools. Everything was around the adoption of these things, not the training of these things. We gave 0 credit for training. My team was 100% compensated on the adoption of these things. And finally, the places. And while it's nicely alliterative, places means more than the physical space. It means the virtual environments. It means the conditions within which we engage each other. and how we engage and the safety that we're allowed to do that engagement with. And this became the way that we scaled to 400,000 people in a matter of about 6 years. So I'll leave you with this. Mediocrity has never cost so much as what we're paying right now. And the leaders who understand that are the ones who will invest their AI dividend wisely. Not by automating just the happy paths and calling it done, but by using the time and the money that AI frees up to do what only humans can do. Build genuine differentiation, earn trust at the edges of our organization, and create outcomes that your competitors cannot replicate with the same model at the same price. IBM has lived this. We began this journey in 2012. The stock was at $102. Today, it's about $300. That's not a technology story, it's a culture story. Our people, practices, and the places working together for almost a decade made that happen and made the results possible. And that's what's available to every one of you in this room. Thank you, and always look at the status quo with disdain. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. Who's got our first question for Phil? We have about 9 minutes for questions. I see your hand up here.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you so much.
You bet.
I love that you focused on training. My team and I focus a lot on training and working with the HR team. So did you find any modalities or methods of training better for certain teams than others? And how did you go about that?
The short answer is no. We obviously had a baseline set of curriculum, but as I said, none of the training was generic. We didn't use case studies. We would introduce concepts. We had generally speaking, during that 1 week of onboarding, which was our training week, if you will, the model was a 20-30-10 model, which was 20 minutes of introduction to a topic or a thing, 30 minutes of the team using it on their project, and then 10 minutes of reflection. And so in that sense, there was actually very little curriculum. It was all about, just getting them to use the new things in their context. There's so much evidence of people going to cool seminars at Stanford D School or wherever, and you do these case studies, and everybody comes back all enthused, but you don't know how to apply it. And you certainly don't have the confidence that it can be applied within the context of your systems and processes. And that's what we were really trying to do, is give teams not just an introduction to the new thing, but how does the new thing work in their environment? I'll carry on one further thing. For the first year, every team that we onboarded into the program had one of my people shadowing them. I called them my psychiatrists. And the role of the psychiatrist was not to do any work, at least for the team. The team has to do all their own work. But the psychiatrist was there when they ran into questions. The psychiatrist was obviously an expert in the things that we were inserting. But more importantly, what that person was doing is they were witnessing all of the antibodies around the team and how they were trying to pull that team back into the old world. We'd hear all of the stuff rain down from the executives that was pulling them back to the old world. We'd see the HR system that was promoting people, even though they couldn't spell the word AI, whatever it might be, right? As we discovered all of those antibodies, the role of the psychiatrist was actually to bring those learnings back to my team, and we would go out to those parts of the organization and fix it. My team, just to give you a sense, this is all in the book, and I do hope you all pick up the book. I think there's plenty for everyone. As I write in the book, as you'll see, one of the chapters is on my leadership team. The transformation program team, only about 25% of the team was expert in the things we were introducing. The rest of the team were the liaisons to HR, the liaison to the finance, the liaison to legal, the liaison to the business, and our salesperson or our communications person that was working with the comms groups around the organization to get the stories of progress out. The other thing we did was zero evangelization, zero. We didn't go around hawking the new program to the world and saying the world's going to be better. We went team by team, and as teams would exit the boot camp and then ultimately over the next several months deliver their deliverables, those team people were captured on video and they told their story of how they were impacted by the changes. So a lot to unpack around the teams and the leadership, but that's kind of how we did it. Thank you.
Other questions? Right here.
Thank you for your overview of that. It's really valuable. Most companies aren't the size of IBM. And one of our most valuable commodities is time. And so how do you find, and the day-to-day just eats up that time. What's your strategy for making that time to really implement these changes?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Scale is interesting. I tell the story, and only half facetiously, because I think it's a lot true. I learned about scale in my first startup. I did 3 startups before the third one was bought by IBM. The first one, I started it myself back in the early 80s. We didn't call them startups. I didn't know anything about money. We didn't have venture capital. I hired another person. That person became my partner in the company. Everything was cool. Then we hired our third person, and all hell broke loose. And I realized that that was the first time that we could hold a meeting that not everybody was in the room. And that's all that scale is. And so for me, working at the scale of 250 to or 400,000 is actually the same problem, which is how do you get people aligned that aren't always in the room all the time? And so I spent a lot of time on, that's why it's how the idea of the release blueprint came is in terms of you ask how to focus. What I've determined best how to focus is making sure that everybody on a team is aligned with the shared intention. And so I spend, as a leader, I spend virtually all of my time making sure that the teams I'm responsible for, whether it's 1 or 1,000, just making sure they're aligned on intention. If everybody understands and shares the values of the organization or program and the intention of the project, my experience has been, and I have great confidence in humans to then make that happen. So that's how I do it there's a lot of tactics. When I got to IBM, I realized that the role of the admin was to fill up my calendar. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. That's not how I want to see the world. So I would do things like, pull time off my calendar that people couldn't grab. But that was it, working on intent. The other thing again, just tactically, I'm completely opposed to one-on-one meetings. My door's always open. If somebody has a problem, I would tell people, absolutely, if you have a problem, an obstacle, come get my advice. But if we're going to have a meeting and come to a decision, if you come to decisions one-on-one, to me, that's a problem, because all of a sudden you're developing intent and not everybody's in the loop. So that was kind of just another thing that has served me well. But that getting back to intent, making sure that we share intent, and making sure that the decision process is open to the full team, I find that humans respond pretty well.
The zero human company is a thing these days. I don't know if my mic was on. Zero human company has been talked about a little bit. I like the idea of a 2-person company.
Yeah, sounds good, but it's fun working at scale.
Lonely.
It's kind of like Atlassian is famous for, it's funny, Atlassian is famous for 100% remote, right? And then I was watching I think I was watching the F1 race. I was watching something the other day, And there was this, I think it's in Sydney, it's this massive Atlassian building. It's 100 stories. And I'm like, wait a minute. I thought they didn't have a headquarters. But,
Well, good. That's about all we have time for. I want to just share two things that I wrote down. Mediocrity has never cost so much, and treat status quo with disdain. So, Phil, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Give Phil a